So this is an introduction to McCay, chapter 15, Absolutism and Constitutionalism. And it covers the time period 1589 through 1725. So this is the first of our chapters that's going to cover the 17th century. And then there'll be several others, typical McCay, that are going to go back over this same time period with other perspectives. For this chapter, the principal focus is political. This is a political history chapter, and the setup, the structure that McCay puts in place is comparing the two great theories of this century, absolutism or absolute monarchy versus constitutionalism, the idea of a limited government based on some kind of written understanding or law. Those are the big strokes of this chapter. So the big questions that we're going to have to confront. First of all, how does absolutism arise out of the chaos and violence of the 16th century? We spent a lot of time on the 16th century and its horrors and failures and religious wars. Absolutism, in McCay's argument, is a consequence of that chaos. So how does 16th century chaos lead to 17th century absolutism? We'll look at the two big states of this era, which are France and Spain. Broadly speaking, France is going to be on the way up, Spain is going to be on the way down. Why does that happen? In the 16th century, clearly a century of Spanish domination. They're going to be pushed aside by the French. Why? We're going to look at the differences between Eastern and Western European states. Why do Western European states develop differently with different absolutist traditions than the ones in the East? How does that happen? Why does that happen? And then finally, we'll turn to constitutionalism. What is it? And why does constitutionalism triumph in England and the Netherlands, where it does not in places like Spain or France or Russia? What's the difference? Why? Okay, so now let's turn to the specifics sections of this chapter. The first is McCay's sort of setup section, which he calls 17th century crisis and rebuilding. And he's basically introducing his argument by setting up what he calls the common crises and achievements of 17th century Europe. Basically, what he's talking about here is the 30 Years' War, which is the last and most awful of the European religious wars. Although it begins as a religious war, it clearly does not end as one. But its devastation is extraordinary and almost unprecedented. And there are other problems that arise out of the 16th century into the 17th. And McCay is going to sort of set those up as the foundation, as the necessary circumstance for absolutism. Then he turns to the second section, which is absolutism in France and Spain. And his question here is, what factors lead to the rise of the French absolutist state under Louis XIV, and why then does absolute Spain decline in the same period? McCay's essential argument is going to be that because of the horror and violence of the 16th century, states and people are willing to turn and give power to absolute monarchs because that's the only way you can stay safe. Because strong absolute monarchs are how we preserve the state in the face of these very destructive impulses. So that's his basic argument in France, and then he's going to compare Spain. Spain declines, France rises. Why? Then, to sort of carry on his roll call, we'll get a shorter section on absolutism in Austria and Prussia. The Habsburgs are going to turn their attention after the 30 Years' War from their sort of lands within the Holy Roman Empire and turning more and more towards Austria. and Central Eastern Europe. We're also going to see Prussia as a significant player here. And that McCay's question is, what were the social conditions of Eastern Europe? How do the rulers of Austria and Prussia transform their nations into powerful absolutist monarchies? So what we're getting to see now, sort of a roster of different states, Spain, France, Prussia, Austria, and you're going to need to begin to keep them separate and begin to develop a sense of their own individual arcs and how they're going to evolve. These states are going to be with us in some form for the rest of the course. And so we need to begin to develop our sense of them. Then finally, the last of these sort of roll call sections of this chapter is McCay's section on the development of Russia and the Ottoman Empire. And this is the first time that we're really going to really spend resources on those states in the course. And the question here is, what were the distinctive features of Russian and Ottoman absolutism? These are really interesting states, Russia and the Ottomans, and unfortunately, it often feels in this course like there's sort of afterthoughts, that we sort of stick them in here at the end. McCay puts them smack in the middle of this chapter and asks you to think about how are Russia and the Ottomans part of these absolutist developments, and then what's distinctive about them, what's different. This particular painting, famous portrait of Peter the great Russian Tsar, and his central role in Russian absolutist traditions. So make sure to spend the time to really try and understand and begin to organize Russia and the Ottomans in your thoughts, because they're going to be around for centuries, and we need to keep our eyes on them. There's a couple of really good primary sources in this section that you want to make sure to pay attention to. One is called A German Account of Russian Life by this very grumpy German guy named Olarius, who basically just slams the Russians, slams them as stupid, brutal animals and how awful life is there, and extremely biased source, but a nice sort of perspective, a Western European perspective, what they were thinking about Russia at this time. Much more fun and perhaps interesting is the account of Hurrem Sultan, who was just a fascinating story. Hurrem was a woman who, as a young girl, was captured. She lived in Poland, what we would call today actually Ukraine, and she was taken as a slave into the Ottoman Empire. She becomes one of the concubines of the ruler of the Ottoman Empire, the Sultan, and then shockingly, breaking all precedent, he marries her and legitimizes her children, and she becomes this tremendously powerful figure within the Ottoman Empire, within the Ottoman court. And McCay gives you a sort of an introduction to her story, which is completely fascinating and worthy of your time, and sort of a useful counterpoint to all of this great men theory of this chapter. Okay, so after we've done that roll call of all these different absolutist states, then we turn to the alternative. What's the flip side of the coin? If you're not going to go absolutist, what are you going to do? You're going to turn to constitutionalism. And the constitutional alternatives here are England and the Dutch Republic. And the question that McCay puts is, how and why do the constitutional state triumph in the Dutch Republic and England? In other words, why do we see different developments in these two northern European states that we do in the southern and central and eastern European states? Why? And what is constitutionalism anyway? How is it different from absolutism? Now, just a small spoiler alert. It's not because there aren't rulers in the Dutch republics or England who want to be absolute. It's not that the rulers are somehow nicer or more merciful or something like that. No, it's more complicated and I think more interesting. So get these concepts straight. When we get to court in the class, we can address those stories. McCay gives you another very good primary source in this section, where he gives you a piece of John Locke and his two treatises on government. Locke is one of the really important political philosophers of the course of Western history. He's really going to lay out the foundation for constitutionalism and why constitutionalism is the appropriate foundation for a government. So be sure to spend time on this excerpt of Locke and try and understand it, so that when we get to him in class, you'll have the foundation you need. Finally, the last section of this chapter is on Baroque art and music. And the basic question here is, well, what was the Baroque style in art and music, and where was it popular? It's a wonderful piece of artistic history. You'll, of course, decide for yourself how much you enjoy the Baroque, but it's a very dramatic style. And the short introduction to Baroque is that it is the art of the powerful. Baroque is going to be the art that is used by these absolute states as they try and assert their authority. It's the art that's going to be used by the Catholic Church as part of the Catholic Reformation as it tries to assert its control and reassert its authority over religion and society. And that art is going to produce tremendous drama, tremendous contrasts. This particular picture, for example, by Rembrandt, The Night Watch, and you can just see, even in this small version, the brights, the darks, the contrasts, the drama, the motion, all of this, which you'll be introduced to at the end of the chapter. Okay, so it's a great chapter. Keep your eye on the big political contrasts, and I'll see you in class.